I'm Mark Golub. Welcome to a special edition of In the News, focusing on the rather heated controversy generated by Peter Beinart's dramatic op-ed published in part in the New York Times, in which Peter announced to the world that he no longer believes in a Jewish state. The piece shocked much of the Jewish world, even rocked much of the Jewish world, because Peter Beinart has been the poster child for those Jews who are critical of the way in which the State of Israel treats the Palestinians, critical of Israeli policy for its settlement policy, which Peter believes is an obstacle to a two-state solution, which Peter feels Israel has a responsibility to implement, while at the same time, Peter's been seen as a staunch Zionist, wholly committed to the future well-being and security of the state of Israel. Which is why Peter has not only been a darling of the left, of groups like J Street, New Israel Fund. Peter's also been embraced by the mainstream Jewish establishment. Peter has spoken at AIPAC, at the Federation's General Assembly, at the American Jewish Committee's Global Forum. For a period of time, Peter Beinart did an ongoing podcast series with one of Israel's leading centrist figures, Daniel Gordis, of the Shalem College in Jerusalem. The two even took their debates on the road, appearing on various college campuses and at synagogues. JBS televised one of their debates at the Hoffman Lecture of Temple Beth El in Stamford, Connecticut. So even though Peter was a harsh critic of Israel, he was treated as a credible voice by the larger Jewish community, and they took him seriously when he said that while he wanted Israel to live up to Jewish values in its treatment of the Palestinians, he was also profoundly devoted to the state of Israel. By the way, Peter Beinart is a modern Orthodox Jew. His children attended the Heschel Day School in Manhattan. He's a graduate of Yale and a Rhodes Scholar. So he's obviously very bright and very articulate. And in all of my personal dealings with Peter Beinart, I've experienced him the way many others, including Daniel Gordis, have experienced him, as a lovely man. I disagree with him profoundly, and have told him so on his 2 appearances on L'Chaim. But I don't believe Peter is a bad man with evil intentions and a secret desire to do harm of any kind to the State of Israel or the Jewish people. To the contrary, I think Peter suffers from Jewish idealism. And for whatever reasons, he's blind to the realities of Palestinian rejectionism of any Jewish state in any part of Eretz Yisrael. Peter's inability to criticize the Palestinians for their hatred of Jews, for their celebrating the wanton murder of Jewish civilians, men, women, and children, in pizza shops and discotheques, in buses and at bus stops, of incidents of hacking rabbis to death in the midst of prayer, or of murdering people celebrating Passover at a family gathering, or of digging tunnels so as to murder Jews in kibbutz dining halls, or slitting the throat of an infant in her crib, or Peter's inability to criticize the notion of a Palestinian state that would be Judenrein, and on and on and on. Peter's need to excuse every Palestinian malevolence, including Palestinian rejection of every single peace plan offered them, beginning with the UN partition plan itself, which, had the Palestinians accepted, they would now also be celebrating more than 70 years of Palestinian statehood. Peter is moved by none of this. Peter only sees Israel as an occupying force on the West Bank, brutalizing the Palestinians and denying them democratic rights. To many in the Jewish community, Peter has never been seen as pro-Israel. But overwhelmingly, the Jewish establishment embraced him. Why? Again, because he had one overarching commitment, and that was to the well-being and security of the Jewish state of Israel. And Jews can disagree about which policies are best for the state of Israel to implement, so long as they are committed to the existence of a thriving and secure Jewish state. And that was Peter's position until 2 weeks ago, when he came out with a long piece in the progressive Jewish magazine and news site called Jewish Currents, for which Peter Beinart is editor-at-large, in which he announced that he was abandoning his commitment to a Jewish state of Israel in favor of a Jewish homeland in some form of binational polity of Jews and Muslims he called Israel-Palestine. And this rocked the Jewish world, because it was Peter Beinart who was saying it, and because he had a certain credibility enhanced by the Jewish establishment, and because the entire pro-Israel community immediately understood that many people, young and older, would read his piece in the New York Times and would not be educated enough or informed enough to understand the serious flaws in his argument, and they could be swayed to think that indeed there should no longer be a Jewish state of Israel. Well, when Peter came out with his piece in the New York Times, we immediately invited him to come on JBS and explain his dramatic turnaround, which was nothing less than a betrayal of all he said he believed in as a Zionist committed to the existence of the State of Israel. We invited him to come on alone or with someone who would debate him, and something Peter normally relishes, debate. But Peter politely declined our invitation, saying he was too busy. So we invited someone who had written a scathing critique of Peter's piece, and one who knew him extremely well, his podcast partner, Daniel Gordis, who came on JBS and was unequivocal in his condemnation of Peter, calling him a traitor to the Jewish people who had crossed the red line. And Daniel Gordis challenged the American Jewish establishment to no longer include Peter Beinart in their programs. And then we invited a second person who'd also written a blistering critique of Peter's piece, Alan Dershowitz. And in similar fashion to Daniel Gordis, Alan took Peter's position apart piece by piece. And at that point, Peter said he would come on JBS, though he preferred to come on alone. And I said I would be happy to speak with him. And that also created something of a firestorm. When we announced Peter would be on JBS, viewers emailed me telling me I was doing something terrible. Guy Avraham threatened me. "Look, Rabbi," Rabbi in all caps, "look, Rabbi, if you don't stop pushing his agenda, you will lose your audience. We as Jews, we do not turn the other cheek." And Felix Dunkel's post was perhaps the strongest. It epitomized the condemnations. He wrote me, "Why are you giving voice to the anti-Semite Beinart? He will work hard to help finish the work of the Nazis." Now, it's hard for me to believe that anyone who's watched me over the years and who watches JBS on any consistent basis would think I am pushing Peter's agenda. And the idea that Peter is an anti-Semite who wants to finish the work of the Nazis, this kind of hateful rhetoric is what most of us have been decrying on the general American scene, and sadly, inside the Jewish community as well. Peter's not an anti-Semite. He's not a Nazi. He doesn't want to kill Jews. He doesn't want to finish the work of the Nazis and Adolf Hitler. People who disagree with each other now refuse to talk to one another. And when they do talk, they rarely talk civilly. Isn't that what we all mourn these days? The death of civil conversation and disagreement? So Barbara Lamb sang Blas Verin, I hope I've got the name pretty much correct. Barbara posted, "Rabbi Mark Golub can't help himself. He's just too nice." He answered appropriately, but I would have loved to see Gordis or Dershowitz rip Beinart to threads. And Stephen J. posted, "Once Rabbi Golub asked him to come on the show, he was not going to give him a rough time. He just wasn't." Well, it's not about my being nice or not. This is who I am. This is who I want to be. What I try to be. What I try to have JBS stand for. Civility, even if I disagree with the guest sitting across from me. But this leads to the second, more important, more damning criticism of me and my conversation with Peter. The damning criticism is, I didn't beat him up. I didn't argue with him. I didn't go point by point through his ludicrous article that has no basis in reality whatsoever. And I didn't point out to Peter what threatens the lives of Jews in the preposterous notion he is proposing. I didn't do it. So Steve Frank, who's a friend, someone you've seen on JBS, Steve Frank writes, but Steve Frank writes beautifully in defense of Israel all the time. I hope you've seen his writings. Anyway, he's been on JBS. Steve posted, Rabbi Golub, as others have said here, you were way too deferential to Beinart. You don't have to vilify him, but you could ask him hard questions. And another friend, whose name I won't mention, wrote me, I am deeply disappointed. I believe you seriously helped him legitimate himself. I am upset and believe we should not talk until I have calmed down. Well, I'm sure you can imagine how sorry I feel, how sorry I am to so deeply disappoint a friend. He's even a mentor. That I would so disappoint him he would not even want to talk to me. But in a moment we're going to play my conversation with Peter. You watch. You decide if I legitimated Peter Beinart. JBS has dealt with Peter Beinart. His arguments have been refuted, if not demolished, by two brilliant voices, Daniel Gordis and Alan Dershowitz. I do not see that as my role. I did not see that as my role. Nor was it my goal in my conversation with Peter Beinart. And here's why. It would have been pointless. There's nothing anyone could say to Peter that would move him in any way. And if you've ever heard him in debate, even on stage with Daniel Gordis, he has an answer for everything, for anything you throw at him, for any rational argument you make. Peter has a comeback. In my conversation with Peter, I had no interest in playing into his sophistry. I had one goal in my conversation with Peter. I wanted him to confront and have to answer the real betrayal of his peace. In truth, by the way, Peter said nothing new in his piece. Nothing. It's been what he's been saying to the Jewish community and to the world for 10 years and more, including at federations and in AIPAC and at AJC. It's the same message about Israel's failures. Not one new idea. Only one thing was new in Peter's piece. In his 180, to now say he no longer believed in or supported a Jewish state for the Jewish people. Peter acknowledged in his piece, this was tantamount to spitting in the eye of someone you loved. And that was what I wanted him to confront in my conversation with him. All the rest, the details of his outrageous piece, Gordis and Dershowitz had demolished. But here, I had the chance to say to Peter directly, how could you spit in the eye of people you love? What's that mean to you? In essence, how will you live with that? And if you heard my closing words to Peter, which we're about to play for you, I told him that it's not simply the betrayal of Israel he'd have to live with, or the betrayal of the Jewish people, but it's the betrayal of his grandchildren and of his God. What more would you want me to say to Peter Beinart? And just watch Peter's body language throughout our conversation. There's none of the typical Beinart bravado. I came away feeling that Peter himself knows he has made a very serious mistake. And lest there be any doubt, you will not see Peter Beinart on JBS again. As Daniel Gordis says so well, he's crossed his own red line. His voice should no longer be included in serious conversations about the future of the State of Israel. And unless Peter one day comes to the Jewish people and begs their forgiveness for even suggesting that the first sovereign Jewish state in 2,000 years should turn off its lights and shut down, ending the most vibrant cultural, social, religious enterprise in Jewish life since the Romans destroyed the Second Temple and razed the Jewish capital of Jerusalem in the year 70 CE, until Peter redresses his betrayal of the Jewish people. Peter has forfeited his right to be on JBS or on any other Jewish platform. By the way, for all of you who wrote me lovely notes after my conversation with Peter Beinart, thank you. Blaine Land wrote, "Great interview. Thank you, Mark. I totally 100% disagree with Peter Beinart, but appreciate hearing his side. Thanks again, and keep up the good work." And Barbara Flom Shapiro wrote, "You are always so respectful to your guests, and you try to be fair in presenting their ideas. I admire that. You are really the best, and I am so grateful for all you do. Stay well." And to all of you who wrote me in this spirit, I thank you from the bottom of my heart. So now we're going to replay for you my conversation with Peter Beinart, to be followed by my conversation with Daniel Gordis, to then be followed by my conversation with Alan Dershowitz. And then you assess whether in fact JBS was too easy on Peter Beinart. Be well, my friends. Peter, thank you so much for joining us on JBS.
My pleasure.
So, Peter, what I hope you can discuss is what in the world motivated you, not simply to give up on this two-state solution, but to give up on the Jewish sovereign state. And as you've been an outspoken critic of Israeli policy vis-a-vis the Palestinians for a decade, you outline in detail why you support this new polity called Israel-Palestine. And people can agree with you or disagree with you. But that's not the issue. The issue is that you consciously chose to do something you wrote about in your very first opening paragraph, where you say, in most Jewish communities on earth, rejecting Israel is a greater heresy than rejecting God. So why, Peter, did you decide to reject Israel?
Thanks. As you know, I have supported the two-state solution for my entire adult life. And I've really pleaded with others to try to stop the process of settlement growth that was making a sovereign, viable Palestinian state impossible. But I failed. Despite my efforts and the efforts of others, the settler population in East Jerusalem and the West Bank, which in the early 1980s, Meron Ben-Veniste, the former deputy mayor of Jerusalem, said if it reached 100,000, a viable Palestinian state would be impossible. It is now around 650,000. not by accident, but because the Israeli government has essentially made it cheaper for Israeli Jews to live in that territory. Two of Israel's Supreme Court justices now live in the West Bank. Its newest medical school is in the West Bank. Its second most powerful politician, arguably, Avigdor Lieberman, lives in the West Bank. I have spent a lot of time in the West Bank, and I would plead with your viewers who have not had the opportunity to do so themselves, to do so on the next time they're lucky enough to go to Israel-Palestine. I have stood in villages that are slated for demolition, where every building in that village is going to be bulldozed, not because people have done anything wrong other than they don't have permits that as non-citizens they can't get. And so for me, when I came to the very reluctant conclusion that a viable, contiguous, sovereign Palestinian state is no longer possible, and that it is morally unacceptable to hold millions of people without basic rights. And since Israel has foreclosed on the possibility of a Palestinian state, that I had to think about alternatives that I believed could both give Palestinians the basic human rights that they as human beings deserve, and also allow for the vibrant Jewish society that I believe must be maintained in the land of Israel.
Let me just take one element, because I understand exactly how you feel about Israel's failure. And I've tried to acknowledge it. And again, Peter, people agree with you or disagree with you. And that's the interesting quality about you. You know, you and I have done 2 l'chaims, one alone when you came out with the book, Crisis of Zionism. Then you did a debate sort of with Thane Rosenbaum. You know, I've been to many of your lectures. You and I have been together many times. It's not that we're social friends, but it's I think very highly of you, and I enjoy you. But the things you've said right now that you are critical of, saying to viewers, you know, I wish you would go on the West Bank. You've said that. On L'chaim, you've said it. You've said it in lectures all the time. There's nothing new in your encouraging people to see what you consider to be Israel's shortcomings is not a strong enough word for you. You describe brutality. You describe a lack of democracy. You've been but you've always been very critical. The one thing you haven't ever done is in some way, you know, cross the line. And you write this also, and then I'll give you a chance to answer. You write, questioning Israel's existence as a Jewish state is akin to spitting in the face of people I love and betraying institutions that give my life meaning and joy. Besides, Jewish statehood has long been precious to me, so I've respected certain red lines. You realize you made a conscious choice in the context of things you've been critical of your entire public career. The difference here is you have decided to cross a red line, to using your imagery, to spit in the face of the Jewish community. And I said to myself, you know, I know you. I understand you philosophically. It surprised me, given your passion up till now, for the existence of a sovereign Jewish state. You always argued Israel must be better. Israel must care for the Palestinian. It's unacceptable for the state of Israel, from your perspective, to give rights to Jews in Israel that are not given to everybody, most specifically the Palestinians. But you've always done that within a context of a sovereign state of Israel. Is there a way for you to explain to me and the audience, something happened inside you where you said, I still feel what I feel, but somehow I am ready to spit in the face of people I love? That's what I want to understand, Peter.
So I guess there are 2 ways of answering that. There's an intellectual way and an emotional way, right? And you are gesturing at both. Emotionally, I would say, First of all, I try to anchor myself in a sense of myself as a Jew that stands outside of this conversation, or what are the norms in any particular community that I'm a part of, right? I wake up, and the others do. I wake up, I pray, I put on tefillin, I study Talmud every morning. I feel rooted in a Jewish conversation, which is much bigger than the norms of what is treif and what is kosher in 2020 in one particular synagogue, right? I mean, our peoplehood, our conversation, our Judaism is much deeper than that, right? The norms change over time. Secondly, and maybe this is the result of having grown up, spent a lot of my childhood in apartheid South Africa. And of course, there are important differences between Israel, Palestine, and apartheid South Africa, some of which I write about. But I will say that it imprinted upon me as a child the sense that morally we are all going to be judged, that we will be judged, and that history renders its moral verdict. And I ultimately believe, I could be wrong, I've been wrong about many things, but I can only do what I think is right. I can't know what's right, universally. I can just do what I think is right. I believe that we will be judged for the oppression of millions of Palestinians who lack basic rights. I believed for a long time that there would be a solution to that it would allow the creation of a Palestinian state. It would mean that all of these stateless non-citizens whose suffering I have seen, just a tiny little bit of it, I've seen myself, and it has brought me to my knees, that there would be a way of solving part of that problem with the creation of a Palestinian state. But events move. Things happen. I was arguing this for 10 years. Over that 10 years, the settler population, not just the numbers, but the deep infrastructure of Israeli control has been deepened and deepened and deepened. And so at a certain point, I was making these arguments, and I began to think, I'm not convincing myself that a two-state solution is possible. Almost all the people I know who really know reality on the ground have come to the conclusion that a viable Palestinian state, not something that doesn't have a capital in East Jerusalem, doesn't control the Jordan Valley, is under security control, that's not a state. An actual state, have come to the conclusion that this is not possible. And the switch, and I was at a dead end. And so I began to read. A lot of writing by Palestinians and Jews about one integrated space. I began to read a lot of writing about the way other conflicts have changed. And I began to read a lot about the history of Zionism. And I came to the conclusion that the core of my identification, my solidarity, my love, was not actually a Jewish state, but it was a Jewish society, as I call in the piece, a Jewish home. In this, I've been influenced by people like Ahad Ha'am. Ahad Ha'am was probably the second most important Zionist thinker after Theodor Herzl. He didn't believe in a Jewish state. He believed in a Jewish society. And I make the argument in my piece. One could certainly people disagree with it. God knows I'm not infallible. But my argument is that a vibrant Jewish society that provides refuge and rejuvenation is absolutely possible within either a confederation or one equal state. And that the path that Israel is on, if it continues down the current path of entrenching its control in the West Bank, will lead us to very, very dark places. Perhaps another act of mass expulsion and violence and war that will ultimately be terrible, not just for Palestinians, but will ultimately be terrible for Israeli Jews.
Okay, but when you said intellectual and emotional, do you feel you've described both?
Yes.
Okay. I have a couple of reactions.
Please.
And again, to my audience, I refuse to vilify. I happen to disagree with Peter, but again, I've known him a long time, and there are people, Peter, who've said, oh, they're cynical. Why did Peter do this? Because Peter really wants to draw attention to himself. This is all about press. And I said, that's nonsense. Then you don't know who Peter Beinart is. Whatever else you are, wrong or right, I have always respected the passion with which you've taken a stand. And I believe you want the best for the Jewish people, the state of Israel, the Palestinians. I believe that. And if people think I'm naive, I don't care.
Thank you.
But I've also said to you, I've been honest with you where I disagree with you.
Yeah,
when you say to me, for example, some of this comes out of your Talmudic study.
Mm-hmm.
The Talmudic, the paramount Talmudic principle, the ultimate ethic in the Talmud is pikuach nefesh.
Yeah,
that ultimately every other law is set aside to save life.
Right.
And part of the problem now, and it is intellectual and maybe it's emotional too, Peter, is that for many people, they understand the Jewish tradition to say the first concern we have is for the Jewish people, and that it doesn't stop there. And the Jews who let it stop there are not understanding the Jewish tradition. And the Hillel line is often used to explain the complicated way in which all human beings live. You must be you must be concerned for yourself, but it can't end there. The feeling we have now is that there has been a subtle shift in your thinking, where on the one hand, you would have said again so much of the same things today had you and I had this conversation 2 months ago, 5 months ago, the exact same thing. The one difference is you would have also said, but there must be a Jewish state that thrives and survives. In that context, you would then say certain things are incumbent upon that Jewish state, but they're secondary. It seems the flip in your thinking has now been there is some greater universal value and goal, which I respect. My sense is that most Israelis, you and I we might disagree, most Israelis are in fact sympathetic to the Palestinians. I speak to Israeli after Israeli, and in polls, they don't hate Palestinians. And nothing would make Israelis happier than if their children and grandchildren no longer had to serve in the IDF, in Hebron, or on the Gaza border, and that would be peace between Israel and Palestinians. But that ultimately, the greatest good is the good of a Jewish state, what it's done for the Jewish people, what it says about Jewish history, and what it says about pikuach nefesh. And it's not about the Holocaust for me at all. And you make that point very strongly in your piece. But it is about Jewish self-determination, which I believe the Jew has no less than the Palestinian, no more, but no less. And it seems that your switch is that there is now something greater in your value system than a state of Israel, a sovereign Jewish polity where Jewish life is worked out in all of its, grandeur, Peter, and all of its disappointing ugliness. Speak to that.
Right. So I understand that it could come across as that I am a pure universalist who cares no more for Jewish welfare than I do for Palestinian welfare or the welfare of anybody else. Rosa Luxemburg notoriously said, I care no more for the masses of Jews of Eastern Europe than I do for the oppressed people in Madagascar. That is not who I am. That is not the way I see it. I understand. I can't be responsible for the way people perceive me. They're going to perceive me the way I am. But I see the Jewish people as an extended family. That in the book of Bereshit, it tells the story of a family, and in the book of Shemot, in slavery, that family becomes a nation, becomes a people, Bnei Yisrael, Am Yisrael. If I believed that in one equal framework, again, in a confederation or a federated state, that Jews, that pikuach nefesh would be threatened, that Jews would be in physical danger, I would not advocate this position. At the core of my contention, one of the central contentions of my piece is that oppression breeds violence. That Israel is a binational state. It controls all the territory between the Jordan and the Mediterranean, even Gaza. I can explain that if you want to talk more about it. And therefore, what we know about binational states is that binational states that hold millions of people without basic rights are more violent, more unstable. I believe that we have been lulled into a false sense of complacency by the fact that for 15 years, the Palestinian Authority has been helping Israel keep things quiet, but that Israel is headed towards intifada after intifada because the violence of oppression breeds violence, and that violence will rebound back on the Jewish state. So I believe that you can think that I'm the craziest person in the world, but my contention is that Jews, this will be better for Jews as well as Palestinians. And if I only thought it would be good for Palestinians, but not good for Jews, I would not advocate it, because I would never willingly, knowingly advocate something that I felt was going to be bad for the Jewish people. I could be wrong, but I would never knowingly advocate such a position.
Okay. And by the way, you say it from your perspective very well. People should just hear you. They don't have to agree with you, and you already said that yourself. Again, I'm only going to repeat myself. You know what? I want to ask you about another criticism you took.
Please.
And
please.
Whether it was in some way a portend of this. You took criticism over giving Omar Barghouti, the founder of the BDS movement, who advocates the destruction of Israel, a platform at NYU where you permitted him to speak unchallenged. Was this because you were already thinking that there should be Israel proper, that there should be this Israel-Palestine?
No, I had not taken that view at that point, and I wouldn't say that he was unchallenged. I think I asked him some actually pretty tough questions. I want to start by saying something about the language. When we say that Omar Barghouti wants the destruction of Israel, right? I think for most people, when they hear that, what they think of is violence, especially given our trauma. When you use the word destruction, right, the notion is, even subconsciously, that what someone like Omar Barghouti is suggesting is that basically there should be some violent attack. Omar Barghouti and I don't agree on everything. We didn't agree then. I don't think we agree now on everything. But what Omar Barghouti is calling for is one state with equality, right? I don't think that the word destruction is the appropriate word when someone is calling for equality, when someone represents a group of people who right now are denied basic freedom. So I talked to Omar Barghouti, as I would also happily talk to Mort Klein. I believe in talking to people that I disagree with. I believe, as it says in Pirkei Avot, who is wise, the one who learns from all people. And I believe, as you know, because I say this ad nauseum, so forgive me for saying it again, is that we are impoverished as a Jewish community when we do not speak to and listen to Palestinians more. And so I was trying to model that.
By the way, I'm going to give you a quote, and I understand that you're saying when people use the word destruction, it implies violence.
Yeah.
And I'm happy to use any word you want that means there's no more Israel. Barghouti has said definitely, most definitely, we oppose a Jewish state in any part of Palestine. No Palestinian. Rational Palestinian. Let me finish. Rational Palestinian.
Yes.
Not a sellout Palestinian.
Right.
Would ever accept a Jewish state in Palestine. Now, he may not mean physical violence, but he does mean the end of the Jewish state, and now you mean the end of the Jewish state.
Right. Yes, that's true. But again, Mark, if you were a Palestinian, right, and either living under a Jewish state as a non-citizen or as a second-class citizen, wouldn't you also want equality? Right? I mean, is this something? Why do we think of this as some crazy pathological desire? People want to be equal. It's a very deep human desire. I don't think it makes Omar Barghouti an anti-Semite.
You are absolutely right, but you're conflating two things. Mm-hmm. Most Jews passionately want as much equality as we can have in life. By the way, equality is hard to come by in every society. Mm-hmm. But the ideal of the Israeli society is, I believe, very much consistent with what you want. The question, and the shift in you is that at one point you argued, again, every single thing you're telling me now, with one slight change. You wanted it to happen from within Israel. And now you're acting as if it can't happen unless there is no Israel.
Right, but this is because, and again, I don't think that most of the critics of my piece, and maybe I've missed some of the criticisms, but I don't think most of the critics have engaged with the central empirical proposition, which I start with, which is to say that it is no longer feasible to create a Palestinian state in the West Bank, Gaza, and East Jerusalem, right? It's not as if I didn't just wake up one morning and change my views because I got up on the wrong side of the bed. I changed my views because realities on the ground have changed. The prospect of actually creating a viable Palestinian state, I can't say it's impossible because you can never say any historical eventuality is impossible. Austro-Hungarian Empire could return. But the chances of it now being created are extraordinarily slim. And so I then become potentially complicit in essentially giving a hector to the status quo, a status quo that I believe is morally unacceptable.
Okay. My last question for you.
Yeah.
You've seen people say, by the way, if you quote your own article, you understand, I'm using that the image is a powerful image. You're a great writer, by the way, Peter. So you write, this spitting image. It's like spitting at people I love.
Yeah.
And there are people now who are going to have a very hard time believing you should have a platform because you have crossed a red line. You've crossed a red line.
Some of them have emailed me.
I'm sorry?
Some of them have emailed me to let me know that.
I am sure that's true. I want to know how you feel about that. And how does Peter, you've given your life to this, Peter.
Yeah.
You're a committed Jew. You're just, people think you're on the wrong side. And I think you're wrong. But at the moment, you've put yourself in a position where it's going to be very hard for you to have the same kind of platform that you used to have. How do you feel about that?
Look, for me, if there's another Jewish person in the world who sees me as an enemy and sees me as someone who hates Jews, who doesn't care about the welfare of Jews, that for me is a tragedy because it means that I failed in what I was trying to do, which was be a loving critic. And one of the things that I try whenever I can, I just spent earlier today an hour on the phone with a guy who had been criticizing me on Twitter, and we decided to have an hour-long conversation. It ended up being a beautiful conversation. I would say to the extent that I have time in my day, aside from spending time with my kids, if there are viewers who want to reach out to me and want to have a genuine conversation, no Jewish person is alien to me. No Jewish person is my enemy. But at the end of the day, I believe that although someone's anger and rage and betrayal matters to me, the thing that matters to me most is the belief that I will be judged. That I will be judged. I will be judged by God, and maybe I'll be judged by my grandchildren. And to me, that's the most sacred task, is to try to make sure that I have done as good a job as being as true to my belief about what's right as possible. I may be wrong, but I have to be true to what I believe.
Yes, you do, and you always are. And what I'm about to say may sound harsh. I don't mean it as harsh. I just mean it as honest as you're trying to be.
Please.
It may very well be that one day your grandchildren and your God will judge you very harshly for giving up on the state of Israel. And I understand what you want out of Israel.
Mm-hmm.
And again, the disagreements we have are not on goal. The disagreements are on what are the facts on the ground. And you have the right to argue that as vociferously as you can, and so does Mort Klein. Good for you. And to your credit, Peter, you'll come on with Mort Klein. And there are some people who won't come on with Mort Klein. But in the end, the real problem here for me, and I hope this is not the last time, not that you're on JBS, but that you and I have a chance to think this specific issue through. Is what you want, in the most ideal sense, people will argue, Peter, with you, it's not achievable. I didn't want to go there at all. I don't want to discuss the details. The only real issue here is Peter Beinart no longer believes there should be a state of Israel. And ultimately, I hope maybe in the future, you and I will have a chance to if that evolves in you any further, I really want you to discuss it with me, because it is the most important issue you are now representing. It casts you in a certain light in the Jewish world, and it also raises very interesting questions, which, Peter, people are going to be talking about. Anyway, I give you enormous credit for coming on JBS to speak with me. You knew how strongly I disagree with you, and I want to say again, while I think you've made a grave mistake and have indeed crossed the red line, which is red for a very good reason, I enjoy you on a personal level. I wish you and your family only good health and all good things, Peter. And I hope you one day will come and discuss your position even further with me on JBS.
I would love to do that. I would love to do that.
Thank you. You be well.
Thank you. Be well.
Well, as you can imagine, there are many in the Jewish world, many, who think Peter has lost his mind and who disagree with him profoundly. One of those who believes Peter is wrong is another extremely bright, committed, brilliantly articulate thinker and analyst on the world Jewish scene, Daniel Gordis, Senior Vice President and Distinguished Koret Fellow at the Shalom College in Jerusalem, one of the Jewish community's foremost philosophers. He's a prolific author of some 12 books, including a marvelous read entitled Israel, A Concise History of a Nation Reborn, which won the National Jewish Book Award as the Book of the Year in 2016. And you may have seen Daniel Gordis many times on JBS and on L'Chaim. You may even have seen him debate Peter Beinart on JBS in 2017. And I should also say that Daniel Gordis is one of my favorite people in the Jewish world, and he joins us now from Jerusalem. Daniel, thank you so much for making time for the JBS audience once again.
Thanks for having me, Mark. It's great to see you.
By the way, before we talk about Peter Beinart, we know life is hard for you in Israel, for all Israelis, but how's it going for you personally and your family?
Look, we're very fortunate. Everybody's healthy. One person in my family actually did get it and was pretty sick for a while, but thank God is fine. We're all healthy. We have an income. One of those privileged people who can work from home and don't have to worry about income disappearing. So look, on all the things that really matter tremendously, we're fine, and we're very grateful for that. The hard part is that 2 of our 3 kids right now are in the States, and both of our granddaughters are in the States, and we used to visit them every month. And we actually just last year spent 7 months living in Boston because there was a new one. So to go from living with them and seeing them every day to now having actually no idea when we'll see them again is hard.
Absolutely.
But again, we're like everybody else, doing the best we can and taking it one day at a time, and very grateful for the things that are going well.
And from your perspective, what's the immediate future for the people of Israel? Are you going to go back into lockdown? Will you be in lockdown for the high holidays? And how do you think the Israeli public will deal with that?
Well, look, I think that's an excellent question. Today's July 14th, Bastille Day. As of today, it looks very likely that we're going back to lockdown. All the hints of the government are that if the numbers keep moving, that's what's going to happen. Shortly before I got online with you, they were talking in the government about reducing the maximum number of people who can get together from 20 to 10. There was a big debate yesterday about bars and pools. The same thing that's going on in a lot of different countries and in the United States as well. But they are public. Government officials are actually speaking publicly about the likelihood of on Rosh Hashanah, people only being able to celebrate with their nuclear families, as was the case on Pesach. And a lot of discussion about what to do about synagogues, for example, on Rosh Hashanah. So here, all over my neighborhood, there's all these outdoor services, and I assume that's what will happen. We actually had, during the beginning of the lockdown, when nobody could even be outside, you were really supposed to be in your house. People davened on their porches, but you could hear each other and you could sing together, and that might be what happens on Rosh Hashanah. Look, in the scheme of things, it's not the way you want to celebrate Rosh Hashanah, but if that's what it takes to beat the virus, then that's what it takes to beat the virus. It's a tough time for humanity at large. And so I think we'll be in lockdown, but, I'm not an expert, and I don't think anybody really knows. It depends on where the numbers go.
Okay. I appreciate the update. All right, Daniel, let's go to the Peter Beinart piece. You wrote your own piece, highly critical of Peter's call for what in essence is a one-state solution. For our audience, what are your principal criticisms of Peter's proposal?
Well, there are many. The first one, and I didn't even go into this in my piece, is that it's completely unworkable. I mean, someone as understated, as thoughtful, as sedate, diplomatic as Daniel Shapiro, who was the Obama administration's ambassador to Israel. And, some people love the Obama administration. Some people were more critical. But I don't know anybody that doesn't really have a tremendous amount of admiration for Ambassador Shapiro, who happens to be a personal friend. He wrote in a series of posts on Twitter that it was utopian nonsense. For somebody like him to say something like that, we're already way out. So part of it is just that it's utopian nonsense in the sense that you're going to combine these two countries. What does that actually look like? You're going to combine the Palestinian Authority and the Israel Defense Forces. They're going to be under one central command. Or if you have two different populations, both of which see this as a home and therefore by definition don't want to become either one, a small minority, what happens when there's a vote about taking in all the Palestinian refugees, no matter by whose count, right, in the whole area, from Lebanon to Syria to Jordan and Gaza and so on and so forth? You know how the Jews are going to vote. You know how the Palestinians are going to vote. The country will fall apart at that. Let's say something goes south in America for Jews. And we know that applications for Aliyah are at a very high rate relative to recent years. And God forbid something even worse goes, and let's say 1 million or 2 million American Jews. It's unthinkable, but let's just imagine, right? That they want to come to Israel. Well, we can understand the vote going the other way. There's no shared sense of destiny. There's no real sense of it being a variable size pie. It's a fixed size pie, and one person's gain is one person's loss. So it's totally unrealistic. That's the first problem with it. The second problem, of course, is that we have to ask ourselves, what was a Jewish state meant to accomplish? Peter likes to talk a lot about annihilation. And to say that annihilation is, our grandparents' generation worry, it was the generation of Hitler and post-Hitler. And yes, that was a serious problem, he would say, in the middle of the 20th century. But the world has changed and the Jews are not about to get annihilated again. And we should stop talking about annihilation. Okay, I mean, I'm prepared to say that annihilation is not the major factor in the Jewish world that it used to be. And thank God for that. But I would also point out that one of the reasons that annihilation is not the issue that it used to be is because you have a sovereign, powerful state of Israel. In other words, we're not safe in Israel because of the goodwill of our neighbors. We're safe in Israel because of our security forces, which we'll come back to. I'm sure we don't do everything perfectly. I'm personally opposed to the occupation having been conducted the way it's been conducted. I am personally opposed to annexation in the way that it's being discussed right now. So Peter and I don't actually disagree about everything, but where he's taken this to, for me personally, has crossed a whole array of red lines. So the first one is that it's really unrealistic. It's completely utopian nonsense, as Ambassador Shapiro says. The second one is, as I was saying, what is Israel supposed to accomplish? So if it's supposed to accomplish absolute safety for the Jews, well, clearly, I mean, that's over the minute you have some sort of shared security apparatus after 100 years of conflict. I mean, anybody that knows anything about this region understands that. But much more than that, and here's what I think Peter and most American Jews don't really understand. Anybody who thinks about Israel, not anybody, but most people in North America, especially in the Jewish community, who think about Israel in regular conversation, think about Israel really as a political entity in conflict. The vast majority of American Jewish discussions about Israel are in some way about the conflict. It could be about annexation. It could be about Bibi. It could be about Iran. It could be about Gaza. It could be about Hezbollah. It could be about Hamas. It can be about the Iran deal. It can be Obama is good or bad for Israel. It could be Trump is good or bad for Israel. But all of those conversations have one thing in common. They look at Israel as a country under attack. Now, that is technically true, but it's not the experience of Israelis on a day-to-day basis. I would suggest that the experience of Israelis on a day-to-day basis is that we are reinventing what Jewish peoplehood and what Jewish life can look like in a world in which Jews don't have to fear for their physical safety. Jews, because they're not a minority, don't have to deal with assimilation. And Jews, because they're not a minority, don't have to deal with an overriding outside culture trying to change theirs. This is the place, this is the laboratory where you get to imagine, what if I felt safe? What if I wasn't afraid of assimilation? What if there wasn't a Christian or Muslim or communist or whatever culture pushing in on me? What could I make Judaism look like? Culturally, spiritually, linguistically, artistically, literarily, and so forth. That's what this place is really all about. And that, of course, immediately ends the moment that you try to implement something like what Peter has, because assimilation does become an issue, because security does become an issue, because a wider cultural pressure on you does become an issue. So what Peter wants to do, it seems to me, or at least what he would create by virtue of his plan, is to end the reality of Jewish physical security. And as a result of that, end the reality of Jewish physical security, which leads to the reality of the sense of Jewish confidence that brings about the rebirth of Jewish life in the state of Israel. Very few people in America who talk about Israel today talk about the rebirth of Jewish life. They don't talk about poetry. They don't talk about literature. They don't talk about language. But that's what's exciting here. The conflict is not exciting. And I think Peter either doesn't care about that or doesn't really understand it. And therefore, what he needs to do is to assuage his own guilty conscience because of what seems to him to be the untenable nature of the occupation, and any price, including the end of Jewish security, including the end of the Jewish state, and including the end of the revitalization of the Jewish people, any price is worth paying to assuage his conscience and the conscience of other progressives. And most Israelis look at him and scratch their heads and say, we don't have any idea what you're talking about, but we're, of course, not interested. And of course, he's making much bigger waves in America than Israel because people read about it. They see what the basic argument is. They say, okay, well, that's completely irrelevant. And then they go on. So there's all of that. I'll just say one last thing. And I think somebody really ought to do this. I haven't done it yet. His piece, the piece in the New York Times is very short. But the piece that he wrote in Jewish Currents is very long. It's some 7,000 something words. Somebody really needs to go line by line by line and show all the sleights of hand, not lies, but tricks, to quote a person saying X something, but taking them entirely out of context. It's really a very intellectually dishonest piece. And as I wrote in my piece, Peter is assuming, or he's banking on the ignorance of his readers to be able to pull that rabbit out of that hat. And unfortunately for all of us, it's a good bet for him. The vast majority of his readers don't begin to know nearly enough to know when he's pulling the wool over their eyes. So in addition to everything else, I think it's a very intellectually dishonest piece. But that's a start.
Oh, that's a start, Daniel. By the way, I was going to go in one direction, but your last comment is so interesting. I don't know if you can do it without looking at your piece or at his piece. And it's interesting. When I read it, and I read the piece in Jewish Currents, it's very long and very involved. But as I read it, there were many things I said, I just can't believe anybody's making this argument. But I didn't think he was trying to be duplicitous. I didn't think he was thinking, I know this is ludicrous, but my reader isn't educated enough or experienced enough to understand where I am. What you were saying, basically, he was being deceptive. So for me, it was, I don't think Peter Beinart ever says to himself, I'm going to pull the wool over everybody's eyes. I believe that is a more fundamental problem. The wool is over his own eyes. But can you give me an example, even just one, of something you read in his piece where he presents something as if it's fact, and you know for a fact it's not true?
I'll give you three. I know you asked for one, but I'll give you.
I'd much rather three, Daniel.
Okay, perfect. No, because they're all slightly different. So, for example, he says the possibility of Israeli mass expulsion of Palestinians, ethnic cleansing of the Palestinians out of the West Bank is a possibility. He quotes three people: Tom Segev, a very left-wing Israeli historian who I guess might have said that. I didn't bother checking the reference. He quotes another journalist, I forget who it was, and then he quotes Syed Kashuach, who's an Israeli Arab writer. And he says, Syed Kashuach says that ethnic cleansing of the West Bank is possible. And I thought to myself, really? I mean, Syed Kashuach and I don't agree about everything, but that's a little strong for somebody who is as smart and as talented as Syed Kashuach is. So I actually did follow that link. The link takes you to a review of a novel that Syed Kashuach wrote in which ethnic cleansing is raised as a possibility. Now, does Peter Beinart not know that the footnote that he's giving to Syed Kashuach saying that ethnic cleansing is a possibility is a footnote to a book review of a novel? Now, as you pointed out, Peter went to Yale. And I think if you did that, and I mean this really seriously, I think if you did that in a paper at Yale and you submitted it, you would get a failing grade, because your professor would expect you to know the difference between a historical text or a piece of advocacy and a piece of fiction. And I find it very hard to believe that Peter Beinart doesn't really know the difference. I'll give you another example. He quotes Jabotinsky in a piece from 1923, The Iron Wall, in which Jabotinsky says, the Arabs are indigenous and they have their pride and they love their land as much as we love our land. And, so even somebody as right-wing as Jabotinsky, who of course is the intellectual forebear of Menachem Begin, who's the creator of the Likud party, which is then inherited by Bibi Netanyahu. So, even Jabotinsky, who is somehow the intellectual great-granddaddy of Bibi Netanyahu, he himself says that the Arabs are a people with dignity and so on and so forth. That's true. Not only does he say that, I actually personally agree with that. But therefore, says Jabotinsky, they will never agree to a peace deal until they hit an iron wall. And Jabotinsky ends this piece, which Peter does not quote, by saying that the only way to get peace eventually is by refusing to make peace now, because as long as they think they can get rid of us, they're going to try to do that. And of course, Peter falls exactly into that trap by allowing them to think that they can end the Jewish state. So that's another example. There are lots of others that could be given, but I don't think that partly quoting something when you're as bright as Peter is, when you're as academically trained as Peter is, I don't think that's a slip. I actually think that it is conscious. And the last thing that I'll say is this, and this is an incredibly important piece. You read the piece. I read the piece. There's virtually no acknowledgement in the 7,000 something words of this piece that the Palestinians bear any responsibility at all for their own fate. It's about the evils of Israeli occupation. It's about the oppressiveness of the Israeli military presence, about the non-democratic nature of the Israeli, conduct of the West Bank, all of which very reasonable minds can have a really meaningful conversation about. And there's a lot, as I said before, about that Peter and I actually agree about. But if you read all 7,000 something words, there is really very little attention, almost none, given to the role that the Palestinians have in creating their condition right now. And I actually tweeted something like that shortly after the piece came out. And I said something like, Peter Beinart actually doesn't give the Palestinians agency, which I actually think is kind of racist. It's in other words to say, they're not real men and women. They're not accountable. They have to be treated with, kid gloves. I don't think that people want to be treated that way. They want to be taken seriously as adults. So I said, but even leaving aside what I think is personally the racism of such a comment like that, it's just historically blindsided to say that the Israelis have the responsibility for this and that, and not to say anything about the Palestinian responsibility. And he tweets back and he says, you're saying that I don't give the Palestinians agency is you're saying basically that I don't hold them responsible for their own oppression. Now, look, I mean, partly what this is, it is a play to the nature of the conduct of civil discourse in America right now. In America right now, you cannot have a nuanced conversation. So I don't live in America. I can say whatever I want, right? But I'm obviously enormously pleased to see that America is grappling with its long history of racism the way that it is. And I hope it'll lead to something. I'm not as optimistic as some younger people are. I remember the race riots in Baltimore in 1968 when I was living there. I remember the race riots in 1992 in Los Angeles when I was living there. So part of me is a little cynical and feels that it's just part of America's DNA, and I hope to God that I'm wrong. But you can't have a conversation about, for example, defunding police departments unless you're willing to talk about, for example, black on black violence. Now, in America today, you can't really talk about black on black violence because that's somehow moving the spotlight away from the only critical issue. And that's the same thing that Peter's trying to do. He's trying to say, I want to look only at what the white Jewish oppressor has done. And I'm not willing to look at anything that the Palestinians over the course of the last 100 years or so of the armed conflict may have done. You're accusing me of not holding them accountable for oppression. Now, as soon as you say that, Peter, what you're saying is we're going to have a conversation about the Israeli-Arab conflict, and the only evidence that's admissible are Israeli and Jewish misdeeds. And any Muslim or Palestinian misdeeds are, by definition, in this court of law, inadmissible. That is a third example of what I think is entirely intellectually unfair. And again, Mark, I want to point out what you pointed out before. Peter's exceedingly bright and unbelievably articulate and a graduate of Yale. And if you did any of those three things for a paper at Yale, I really do believe that you would fail. So maybe he has pulled the wool over his own eyes to a certain extent, but I think there's got to be a part of him that has to understand that what he's done here is intellectually, really in terms of its intellectual honesty, fundamentally unsustainable and indefensible. Can one honestly, knowing anything about history and knowing anything about the Jewish people, say that you are not doing inestimable damage to the future of the Jewish people and the present of the Jewish people by ending the Jewish democratic state? Can you not acknowledge that this fundamentally changes the course of Jewish history? And I think that's the problem with Peter's argument. It's not about an issue of, decades or brutal or democratic. The issue is really, really very simple. Peter lives in a world of American Jewish progressives. In the world of American Jewish progressives, universalism is the religion of the hour and the particularism that is also at the heart of Judaism, not instead of universalism, but also in addition to universalism, that particularism, like our people, our history, our destiny, our safety, our country, that's very uncomfortable for American Jews today who are in the progressive part of the world to talk about. So therefore, for them, a Jewish state which somehow preserves the Jewish future feels like something that they can't defend. So they would rather talk about, universal goals, most of which I agree with, right? I mean, fixing the race problem in America and the immigration problem in America and so on and so forth. I probably agree with them about a lot of those things, but I don't think any of that has to come at the expense of my saying, and I also am a Jewish person who knows something about Jewish history, and I'm not in the least bit embarrassed about saying that the Jewish people needs a state. And that, because it's not a popular view in the progressive world, Peter won't say. And I think that's where the betrayal comes from. I think he's actually decided that he cares more about his standing in the progressive world than he does about any damage that he might do to the Jewish future.
All right. Again, you know him very well, too. And I was together with the two of you when you debated at Temple Bethel in Stamford, Connecticut. Was that your only debate, or have you done other debates with him as well?
Oh, no, we've done a bunch. We did our whole series of podcasts, which we recorded at CUNY. And there we met a lot in this recording studio. I don't remember how many times, but we did a debate at Columbia University. We did a debate at Harvard University. We did a debate at that synagogue that you mentioned. And maybe another, I think we debated in Toronto, if I'm not mistaken. So we've probably done it 4 or 5 times.
Okay. And do you enjoy him as a person?
I like him. I mean, we're not socially friendly. The couples have never gotten together.
Okay.
We're a very different age. You know what I'm saying? But I can't say we're friends.
Okay.
But I certainly enjoy my time with him. He's a very smart guy. I've never found him to be in any way, disrespectful or hostile or anything. And
Absolutely.
by the way, quite the contrary. The reason that I was happy that we were doing the podcast together, and I can tell you, by the way, I took a lot of heat for doing that podcast.
Why?
He probably did also. But people would write me and say, you're giving a platform to a guy who's fundamentally hostile to Israel. And he does, he's lying, he's playing with you, he's manipulating you. And I said, look, I can only base myself on what he actually says. He says that he cares about a Jewish state. He says that he's in favor of Israel being a Jewish and democratic state. I'm going to take him at his word. And the reason that I'm willing to debate him, whether in person or on the podcast, is because it's clear to everybody how much we disagree about virtually everything. And we every single time have a completely civil conversation. And I thought that given where the nature of discourse was in the Jewish world back then, maybe it still is, I don't know, it was important for two people to model that you can disagree about really everything.
I agree
100%. Have a really kind of civil conversation. So that's why I did debate him in the past.
Okay, but it's interesting. People were saying to you that you tell me that the criticism you received for doing these podcasts and these debates with Peter was, people were saying to you, don't you understand, he really is, and then they gave you a whole list of things he is, basically saying to you he is being disingenuous in some way, and he may even have different kind of feelings about a commitment to the state of Israel than he seems to. Then he writes a piece, and you tell me that you believe this piece reflects the fact that he has to know that what he's saying is, I'm trying to quote what you said. You were upset with what he wrote because you thought he knew he was distorting at best and dissembling at worst. So in retrospect, do you feel those who were saying to you, you shouldn't be, apart from the fact that there was a style that you and he were able to convey to the audience, which was marvelous. Unfortunately, by the way, Daniel, it has not been picked up by American Jewry or world Jewry as a whole, certainly not an American Jewry. And Israel has always been a contentious, disagreeing place where people have been at each other much more severely than American Jews imagine.
Right.
But I'm wondering if now, based on what you just said to me, and what you also said about how you feel Peter is dissembling in his piece, do you feel those who were warning you had more to say than you may have thought originally?
It's a very fair question. And if I had to do it all over again, knowing then what I knew then, I would still do it. In other words, because I based myself on what he said and how he said it. And I don't want anybody trying to pick into my mind and try to figure out what does he really mean. I want somebody to look and say, what does he write or what does he say, and assume that's what I mean. I don't think it's very valuable to try to figure out what is he really trying to cover up or something like that. Now, I think he's crossed the line. And he and I both received 2 emails. I don't know what else he's received that I didn't receive, but within the 24 hours after his piece and my piece came out, we both received at least 2 emails that were addressed to both of us from 2 different institutions, both of them saying, okay, you guys, you've done it online. I mean, whatever in your pieces written, let's now do a debate. Obviously, it's going to have to be virtual and on Zoom, but let's bring the debate on. Let's have you do it again. And I'll be honest with you, and I'll tell you, I didn't reply all. I just replied to the person who wrote me. I didn't bother including Peter in the response because there was no point creating a whole email to do. But I said, no, I think I'm done. Because I think there are certain lines that you cannot cross in the Jewish world without being in some way a traitor to the Jewish people. And I know that that's a very strong phrase.
And and define for our audience, what's the line he crossed for you?
The minute you want to destroy Israel as a sovereign Jewish democratic state, I will put this very strongly, and I will probably take a deep breath afterwards and say, should I have really put it that way? But I think to a certain extent, you are on the wrong side of history when it comes to the Jewish people. And the claim can be made that you have made yourself an enemy of the thriving of the Jewish people. I believe that the Jewish people in 2020 is in the position that it's in, not only in the Middle East where I live, but in the United States for American Jews and in Israel, in Europe for European Jews. It's not perfect anywhere, to be sure, but all of those groups, Jews in the Middle East, Jews in America, Jews in Europe, would all be in much worse shape if it were not for the fact of what a sovereign, independent, Jewish democratic state has represented for the last 72 years, right? I mean, it is what gave Soviet Jews a sense of yearning to come and join this. It is what breathed new life into American Judaism after American Jews were ashamed of what they had and had not done during the Shoah in the 1940s. It breathed new life into Jewish literature and so on and so forth. You want to end that? I think you're on the wrong side of history. I think you're on the wrong side of fate when it comes to the future of the Jewish people. You can write whatever you want, but I can't appear on a stage with that.
Okay, and I do want our audience to know that after Peter wrote the piece, we contacted Peter and invited him to come on JBS and just explain some of the things that he wrote about and why did he write it and how has he changed? Why has he changed so dramatically? And Peter said he simply didn't have time.
By the way, I was going to ask you before we got online if you actually had invited him to come on board, and we just didn't get a chance because we were catching up and just chatting. So I'm sure he's very busy. We're all very busy, and life is tough. But he's appearing all sorts of other places.
Of course.
Right. I mean, he's doing a big session now with Encounter. Encounter is a group that takes people to Bethlehem, among other cities, to hear how horrible the occupation is and so on and so forth. It has you meet with a certain kind of person and not meet with another kind of person. It has you meet with Arabs who are really very embracing of the idea of living side by side. And you typically don't meet with the Palestinians who say, it's all our land, the Jews have to go. There are Arabs of both types. How do you actually quantify them is a very hard thing to know, and I don't think anybody really knows. But again, when Encounter takes people to that part of the West Bank or to Bethlehem or so forth and has them meet a certain kind of, person that we say in Hebrew, over masach, like he's, screen worthy, right? They're good online. Okay, but so with Encounter, he has time to meet. With you, he doesn't have time to meet. I think that's pretty telling. And if you ask me, is that a check mark in the direction of his intellectual honesty or not? Well, I think you can answer that question.
I want to read you another very brief section of Peter's piece from Jewish Currents. I want your reaction to it. Peter writes, I have begun to wonder for the first time in my life whether the price of a state that favors Jews over Palestinians is too high. After all, it's human beings, all human beings, and not states that are created b'tselem Elohim, in the image of God. And for me, Daniel, the most interesting development that Peter is trying to work towards in this piece is the distinction between a Jewish home and a Jewish state. And Zionism may have begun talking about a Jewish home, but it's clear that the entire thrust of the movement was towards a Jewish state. Peter seems to be saying, for some greater sense of justice, we should step back from the idea of a Jewish state and stay comfortable just with a Jewish home. And I want to know the extent to which you do or do not feel he is making a serious mistake in that distinction.
Oh, he's making a mistake, but it's not a serious mistake. It's not an honest mistake. I think it's duplicitous mistake. So we're going to go back decades. Remember the phrase zero population growth from, 30, 40, 50 years ago?
Absolutely.
Right? Okay. What was the only ethnic group that took that idea seriously?
Jews.
The Jews.
Right.
Right? I mean, it was only a couple of decades after the Shoah We had just literally had a third of the people slaughtered. And I think that's the wrong term, by the way. It's not a third of the Jews who were killed. That's technically correct, but it's the wrong number. The real number is what percentage of Polish Jewry was killed, because Polish Jewry was the crown jewel of the Jewish people all over the world. What percentage of Polish Jewry was killed? 90%. There were 3 million Polish Jews before the war. There were 300,000 at the end of the war. There are 30,000 now. Did Hitler win the war? Well, and there's a reason we're coming back to this with Peter. In other words, did Hitler win the war? Hitler won the war. If you're asking, did Polish Jewry survive? No, he wanted to wipe it out, and he did wipe it out. And a couple of decades later, people start talking about zero population growth. Who are the only people that get on that bandwagon? The Jews. Now, Peter is saying, look, having states does bad things because you get into the business of power and you get into the business of who's included and who's not included. So the Jews should get out of the state business. Okay, well, why don't the Americans get out of the state business first? Seriously, because nobody's going to go kill the Americans. And America, I would actually argue for you, tragically and in all seriousness, is never going to overcome its race problem, even forget entirely, even significantly. I don't believe it's going to happen. And I say that with great sadness. So why don't the Americans first disband? You disband, become 50 independent states or a gazillion independent counties. Let's see how that works out for you. And then talk to us. Why do we have to be first? And I don't mean this to be cute. I mean it to be really serious. There is something dysfunctional about a people that when somebody says we should stop having population growth, the first people to do it are the ones who just got slaughtered in the Second World War. And now people are coming to terms with the problematics of the nation state. And we say, you know what? We want to be first in line to show you what can happen. So I really think in all seriousness, there is a psychological, self-defeating, self-destroying component of American Jewish life because of its universalism that is dangerous, that Israelis frankly look at and they scratch their heads and they want no part of it. And, you know, to quote the Israeli phrase, they just kind of turn off their hearing aids and let Peter Beinart say whatever Peter Beinart wants to say. But then let's go back to the other point that you make. Okay, we'll have a Jewish home, which is what Achad Ha'am wanted, and not a Jewish state. And Peter says Herzl didn't want that. He bases himself on Alt Neuland, which is a novel, just like he bases himself on Sayed Kashuach's novel that we spoke about. It's very slippery. Are you going to base yourself on the political writings, or are you going to base yourself on a novel? And are you going to be honest with your listeners and your readers about what kind of stuff you're pointing to? Are you going to acknowledge that Nathan Birnbaum in the First Zionist Congress said that he wanted there to be a Jewish state? No, you're not acknowledging that. In other words, there's a whole way in which I think this is a lot of hood and winks and all of that kind of stuff, and I think that's not okay. But let's say hypothetically that we could all agree that we would be just fine with a Jewish home in the land of Israel. Again, I think it would take away the self-confidence that leads to the extraordinary rebirth of Jewish culture, which we've spoken about today, and so on and so forth. But let's say hypothetically you could imagine that in an ideal world. Peter, I mean, seriously, you're a smart guy. Jews and Arabs now defend themselves together. What is Hezbollah going to do? What is Hamas going to do? What is Iran going to do? And I'll put myself in this category as an Israeli Jew. Israeli Jews and Palestinian Muslims hate each other. Every single Israeli Jew? No. Every single Palestinian Muslim? No. But as populations, have they basically been at each other's throats for 100 years? They have. So why would you actually invest your retirement money with the same carelessness that you would wager on the future of the Jewish people? No, Mark, you're chuckling, but nobody does that.
Right.
Nobody who cares about their future would take the money that's going to keep their kids alive if, God forbid, something should happen to them, and with the same lack of caution, throw all caution to the wind and say, it'll work out okay.
Absolutely. I'm
going to bet this on some, little startup that nobody's ever heard of, but I think it'll probably be fine. And if it's not, then my wife and children will be on the street, but what are you going to do? No, but I'm really very, very serious. I think that, Peter, you're talking about the future of the Jewish people. I mean, show me where in the Muslim world Sunnis and Shiites can split the same country and not destroy themselves. Look at Syria. Look at Iraq. Look at Iran. Look at Jordan. Look what happened in Egypt with Morsi and so on and so forth. You expect the Jews and the Palestinians to get along better than the Muslims and the Muslims? I mean, you have to be smart enough to acknowledge that that's almost unthinkable. So what you're saying is, I, Peter Beinart, live in the Upper West Side of North America, of New York City, and I circulate in all kinds of progressive circles, and it's very uncomfortable for me that the Jews do what they do in my circles. So in order to assuage that discomfort, what I really need you Israelis to do is to go out of business. And I think there's something fundamentally immoral about it. There's something really that is a betrayal of the Jewish people in a way that makes me, frankly, not angry, but unbelievably sad. I mean, I have to say, I don't know if this piece came out 2 days ago, 3 days ago. Look, this is a hard time for everybody. And you know, it's the smallest thing that can set us off and say, where's the world going to, whether it's American politics or the pandemic or a gazillion other issues, and people that we know are sick and people that we know have lost their jobs. And it's really a terrible time in human history, I grant you. But I have felt this overwhelming sadness over the course of the last 2 or 3 days, because here is a guy who has a lot of followers. He's a bit of a Pied Piper, to put it very mildly, and in the progressive world, not a small Pied Piper. And I want to know, is the Jewish community, the establishment Jewish community that Peter Beinart does not like and does not admire, are they going to say, we're sorry, actually? When you cross the line and you say that you do not think the Jews should have an independent state, you're now a pariah. We would no sooner have a congressman who was opposed to Israel being an existent state come and speak. I mean, are you in the same camp as Ilhan Omar? Are you in the same camp as Rashida Tlaib? I mean, are you really? Because if you are in that camp, then we should treat you the way we treat them, which is to say, hopefully not with disrespect, but we call you an enemy of our people. And I don't know whether the American Jewish establishment and the American Jewish community at large have it in them to actually say that about someone. Now, we know that we can say that about Holocaust deniers, right? I mean, if somebody comes and says, I have new evidence, I calculated the number of trains and the miles of track and the number of people, or I calculated how much Zyklon B gas Germany could have possibly, something like that, we would say we're not interested in your evidence. It's a complete non-starter conversation, because in having that conversation, what you want to do is deny a fundament of Jewish history. Now, here's what I would say a fundament of Jewish history is. 2,000 years of Jewish history prove that the Jewish people cannot live safely and securely without an independent, sovereign state of their own in which they are responsible for their own destiny. 2,000 years of history prove that. And my question now, and it's not to Peter Beinart, but it's to my colleagues who run the American Jewish community, which I admit I left almost a quarter of a century ago to move to Israel, but they're my friends, and I have enormous amount of admiration for these people. Can you actually say, no, we're done? You say that? It's, again, not a perfect analogy, but it's as if you were denying the Holocaust. You wanted to raise the evidence. Again, there are certain fundamentals of Jewish history that are not discussable. Happy to discuss annexation. Happy to discuss occupation. Happy to discuss whether to call it West Bank or Judea and Samaria. Happy to discuss how brutal or not brutal the Israeli occupation has been. Happy to discuss all of those things. But when you say that the first thing in 2,000 years that has kept the Jewish people safe ought to be destroyed, not by the Arabs, but by the Jews themselves, then I think you're a traitor. I think you're a traitor to the Jewish people, and I say that with sadness. But that's the reason, again, I could not now sit in a recording studio with Peter, and I could not now sit on a stage with Peter. I think that our peoplehood and our belonging to the history of the Jewish people and the essence of the Jewish people demand that there be certain red lines. And I think it's an interesting question for the American Jewish community, whether they're willing to draw those lines and stick with them, and time will tell.
You're fabulous. I tell you that all the time. It's so nice that you went out of your way. You made time for me and for the JBS audience. I wish you kol tuv v'hatzlacha. You continue to be safe and sound. And I hope you let me just call you as we continue to try to delve into this complicated Jewish life we have. But I thank you, Daniel, and you are just out of this world. Thank you so much.
It's good to see you, Mark. Thanks a lot.
Well, again, there are many in the Jewish world who have profound disagreements with Peter's stand. And one of them has written his own powerful critique of Peter Beinart's position, which he's published in Newsweek Online. It's by the man who has been for many decades Israel's most articulate defender, Alan Dershowitz, professor emeritus at Harvard Law School and the author of, among scores of other books, Guilt by Accusation and Defending Israel. And in Alan's Newsweek response to Peter Beinart, he begins with this opening sentence. Peter Beinart's advocating the end of Israel as the nation state of the Jewish people is a study in historical ignorance, willful deception, and arrogant rejection of democracy. And as always, I'm most pleased to be joined once again by Alan Dershowitz. Alan, thank you so much for making time again to speak with the JBS audience.
Well, thank you. It's always a pleasure to be on with you because you always ask the best questions and you always are fair, and you really provide an enormously useful service to the American Jewish community and your listeners.
Alan, you write a superb piece for Newsweek. And before you speak about the way in which Beinart's position may be historically ignorant, I want you to explain what you mean when you say that Peter Beinart is guilty of, and these are your words, willful deception.
Oh, it's willful deception throughout the piece. If you read the piece, you would never know, for example, that Israel accepted, that is the pre-Israeli state, Ben Gurion, the Jews of Palestine, accepted the Peel Commission report, which gave them a non-contiguous, tiny little state, much smaller than the Palestinians would get if they accepted the peace offers that had been offered them by the United Nations, by Ehud Barak and Clinton, by Ehud Olmert. He just erases history. He makes it sound as if it's the Israelis that have prevented the Palestinians from getting a state. They could have had a state in 1937, 1947, 1948, 1967, 1990, 2000, 2001, 2008, and they can get one today if they would sit down and negotiate. So it's willful, deliberate deception. You call him an intellectual. That's damning him, because if he is in fact an intellectual, then he's a liar. Because if he knows all these things and denies his readers the right to that information, and I know a lot of people who have read his article who are not very sophisticated or knowledgeable, and they believe it because they don't hear anything about how Israel has been offering the Palestinians a state over and over and over again. And as Abi Ibn put it, the Palestinians never miss an opportunity to miss an opportunity, and they don't know how to take yes for an answer. The only point I'd like to correct you on is when you say that Beinart believes in a state that's both democratic and Jewish. He believes in neither. Let me be very clear. Let me tell you a story that proves that Peter Beinart has no interest in democracy. He doesn't care about democracy. Here's the story. I'm debating him on Martha's Vineyard. It must be 10 years ago. And he starts the debate by saying, Alan, you were one of my heroes. I was part of the Soviet Jewry movement. You were very active in the Soviet Jewry movement. You helped get Sharansky out, many of the others out. You helped bring 1 million Jews to Israel. And now I'm so disappointed in you, he said, because you support Israel, even though Israel has moved to the right. And I said, Peter, do you understand what you're saying? Think about it for a minute. Why has Israel moved to the right? Because of the Soviet Jewry movement. Because 1 million Jews who had lived under communist oppression came to Israel and moved the country from the left to the right. What would you do, Peter? Send them back? What would you do? Not allow them to vote? Peter Beinart doesn't care one bit about democracy. He is a Platonic guardian. He is a know-it-all. He thinks that he knows what's best for the Israelis and what's best for the Palestinians. The fact that no Israeli leaders and almost no one in the Israeli population accepts his idea of one state with a Jewish little homeland, a Bantustan homeland, the fact that none of the leaders of the Palestinian Authority accept it, he doesn't care. He's right. Democracy doesn't matter. Polls don't matter. Votes don't matter. Only Beinart matters. Now, why wouldn't it be a Jewish state. It wouldn't be, because once there was an Israel-Palestine, Palestine-Israel, immediately there would be a demographic war. Who would have the majority? Like in Lebanon. And in Lebanon, the Muslims won the demographic war. The Christians lost it, and there are no Christians to speak of left in Lebanon. The same thing happened in the Gaza Strip and on the West Bank. There are virtually no Christians to speak of. So you'd have a demographic war. The Jews would lose it. The Muslims would win it. And a Palestinian state, according to the constitution of the Palestinian state, would be a Muslim state governed by Sharia law. It would mark the end of Israel as the nation state of the Jewish people. The arrogance of Beinart to ignore what Jews have been working for a century, more than a century and a quarter. I mean, Zionism starts way before Herzl, but even beginning with Herzl. The Jews have worked so hard to get a state. And Beinart, on the pages of the New York Times, is willing to abolish it with the flip of a pen. It's so arrogant. I mean, I would use the word chutzpah, but I actually like the word chutzpah, and I therefore won't use it in describing Beinart. He willfully misinforms as well. He talks about two experiments in history where we've had binational states, and they're both utterly irrelevant. One is South Africa. It's not a binational state. South Africa was a colonialist regime dominated by a tiny percentage of whites. Nelson Mandela, who I helped to represent and who I admired enormously, overthrew that peacefully, by the way, without terrorism in the end. And now it's a largely Black African country, and but it's not a binational state in any sense of that term. The other one he talks about is Northern Ireland. Totally irrelevant. Northern Ireland, ethnically, the people of Northern Ireland are the same. They're all British, Anglo-Saxons. They look the same. They have very similar values. Some are Catholic, some are Protestants. But religion is far, far less important today in Northern Ireland. It's a secular state. It now is one of the leading countries allowing and encouraging abortion, birth control. Religion is less important. And so it was very easy for my friend George Mitchell to help bring about peace in Northern Ireland. Israel would be much more like the failed binational, bireligious states. Beinart never mentions India, Pakistan. You read his article, it's as if today India still includes Pakistan. Obviously, that binational, bireligious state broke up with enormous amount of bloodshed. Another one was Yugoslavia. You could search the article from top to bottom. It's the leading example of a multinational, multi-religious state. Tito put together a fake state, created marriages where they shouldn't have existed between Bosnia and Serbia, Herzegovina and Croatia. What happened? Genocide, massive genocide. Now they've been divorced and they're in peace because they're separate, not because they're together. And so I don't mind having an argument with Beinart. I wish you're here today, but he just is deceptive. He is not an intellectual. He doesn't put the truth and the facts on the table and then say decide. He deceives his readers. He looks down at his readers. He says to them essentially, you're not as well-read or as intelligent as I am, so I'm going to deceive you and prevent you from learning the facts. Let me give you another thing he never mentions in the article. The armed forces, Israel's nuclear arsenal. Who gets it in Israel-Palestine? It would be a disaster. The idea of a Jewish homeland, first of all, he is so totally ignorant of the history of Zionism, so totally ignorant. Sure, Herzl was prepared to accept something less than a state because that's all he could get. He was prepared to go and take Cyprus. He even talked about the possibility of Uganda, ultimately rejected it. All he wanted was a foothold. He went to Egypt and met with the Egyptian leaders and said, give me something in the Sinai around El Arish. But it was all designed ultimately to get a place where the Jews could defend themselves, where they could have autonomy. The idea that a little Jewish Bantus land surrounded by a Palestinian state, which would be a Palestinian state, living at the sufferance of the Muslim majority, which would have the armed forces and presumably the nuclear weapon. And Israel would have this little homeland where it could teach Jewish culture and Jewish values. Ahad Ha'am talked about that. but he was smart enough to understand, and post-Shoah, we're all smart enough to understand that you really have to look at the Psalms. You really have to look at what King David said. Hashem oz li amo yitain. Hashem yivarech et amo b'shalom. God will give the Jewish people strength. And only from strength will there be peace. The reason there's peace in the Middle East today is that Israel has an army, a navy, an air force, an intelligence service, a high-tech service that is qualitatively superior to all the surrounding Arab armies together. If that ever stopped, there would be genocide. That's why after a lot of thought and a lot of concern, I named my piece Beinart's Final Solution. I never use the Holocaust as an analogy, but this is a final solution to Israel. This does not solve the Israel-Palestine conflict. It creates a final solution, which he admits, the end of Israel is the nation state of the Jewish people.
Yes.
It is a disgrace, and I renew my challenge to him. Come on the show. Let's have it out. But the final point is, how dare you tell the Israeli people what they should accept? How dare you tell mothers and fathers who have lost their children defending Israel? I have a cousin, an only child of Holocaust survivors, who died defending Israel. I have so many friends who've lost children defending Israel. How dare you tell them that you know better than them? And you're going to want them to live in a little surrounded Jewish homeland where they'll produce literature and leave it to the great Palestinians and Arabs and Muslims to protect them. That's the past history. That's what Herzl saw in Europe. And that's what Herzl said, never again. And he said, if you dream it, it is not a fairy tale. He dreamt it. Zionism was established on the blood and the backs of hardworking chalutzim and people who built a nation from scratch. And now Beinart on the pages of the New York Times wants to abolish it. Thankfully, Israel's future and the future of the Palestinians will be decided on the ground by Israelis and by Palestinians, not in the op-ed rooms of the New York Times, not in academia, and not in the mind of Peter Beinart.
By the way, Alan, the critics of those on the far left, of the Beinarts and of J Street, of the New Israel Fund, they've always said that deep down, they don't believe in the legitimacy of the state of Israel, that these people don't really love Israel, that it's not appropriate for them to say they are pro-Israel, and that in truth, they're ready to sacrifice Israel on the altar of what they perceive to be justice for the Palestinians. And in some way, Beinart's rejection now of the state of Israel seems to prove the critics of the far left to be right. To what extent do you feel Beinart's piece will do damage to the credibility of the far left, to J Street, groups like the New Israel Fund?
I'd be interested to know whether J Street supports it. I would hope not. I would hope the New Israel Fund wouldn't support it. I would hope that Beinart would be relegated to the wastebasket of American Jewish history, where his article and where he now belongs. He has given up any right to speak as a pro-Israel person. He's now an anti-Israel person. He's now Norman Finkelstein. He's now Noam Chomsky. He's now somebody who rejects the concept of Israel as the nation state of the Jewish people, something that the vast majority of Americans, the vast, vast, vast majority of Israelis accept. Many more Palestinians accept it, but he rejects it. And his notion is so absurd. What he would substitute for Israel is so childish, so absurd. And it wouldn't give justice to the Palestinians because the wars would continue. You think the Israelis are going to just accept this, take away their guns, take away their nuclear weapons? It isn't justice for the Palestinians. I believe in justice for the Palestinians. I have advocated a two-state solution since 1967.
Yes,
I was the first prominent Jew to come out against the Israeli government and say a two-state solution is the right thing. I favor the Alon plan, in which Israel would have taken over the areas of the West Bank which are essential to its survival and national security, but not send in civilian settlements. So I'm the liberal here. By the way, Beinart's not a liberal. He's not a leftist. He believes that the government should support yeshivas. He believes the government should pay for parochial schools and promote religion. That's so anti-civil libertarian. He is not a strong supporter of freedom of speech. You never hear him speak out on behalf of freedom of speech on university campuses. He's a knee-jerk identity politics, left-wing guy. Remember, left-wingers are not liberals. Left-wingers are anti-liberals. Liberals believe in due process, freedom of speech, open debate. He's not that. He's a leftist. And he, you say, would sacrifice Israel for the justice of the Palestinians. No, he would sacrifice Israel for getting invited to dinner parties at universities and being hailed. He's going to now get invited all over the country for big fees to speak on college campuses and make the case against Israel. This is extraordinarily self-serving. He's not doing it because of justice for the Palestinians. If he really believed in justice for the Palestinians, why doesn't he speak out on the Kurds? Why doesn't he speak out on the Tibetans? Why doesn't he speak out on the other displaced people around the world? It's not that he's so pro-Palestinian. It's that he's anti-Israel. But he doesn't believe in Israel as the nation state of the Jewish people.
Well, that is now clear. But you do not think, you don't expect J Street and New Israel Fund to back him?
Well, you know, J Street backed Goldstone when he issued that blood libel, Goldstone.
So what do you think is going to happen?
Well, I would expect that they would come up with some wishy-washy, mealy-mouthed response in which they say, it's important to have dialogue and debate. We subscribe to his ideas to let's continue the discussion and debate, but we don't agree with every aspect of his proposal and plan, but we welcome him into the dialogue and into the big tent of people who have been debating these issues since Ahad Ha'am fought with Theodore Herzl at the Second Zionist Convention. That's what J Street will say.
We only have a couple of minutes left, and I want to ask you a related question.
Yeah.
And it also has to do with your sense of hate speech, free speech inside the Jewish community. Peter did a video interview with Marwan Barghouti, the founder of BDS, at NYU, where he simply gave Barghouti a platform. He did not have anyone with him to debate Barghouti.
Yeah. So
how do you feel about that?
The best proof that Peter Beinart is anti-Israel and anti-Zionist is the fact that Barghouti will debate him. Barghouti was invited to Oxford to debate me at the Oxford Union. He said, I can't debate Dershowitz because he's a Jewish Zionist. He supports Israel. And BDS doesn't allow me to debate a supporter of Israel. The fact that he would debate or dialogue with Peter Beinart is the best proof that he now regards Beinart as anti-Israel because he won't debate anybody who's pro-Israel. And I would debate, I'd debate anybody. I'd debate Barghouti. I would point out the hypocrisy of how the BDS movement, you know, the Palestinian Authority doesn't support BDS because it hurts Palestinians more than it hurts Israelis. You know, the BDS movement singles out one group of people for boycott. It's not a movement. It doesn't boycott human rights violators. It only boycotts Jewish Israelis or American Jews who support Israel. So I don't criticize him for having a debate if it was a real debate with Barghouti.
It was not a debate. He just gave Barghouti a platform at NYU without anyone to really challenge Barghouti. Do you think there's anything wrong with Beinart going to NYU and giving Barghouti a platform without it being in the context of a debate?
Yes, I think there's something wrong with it. It would be like giving Ahmadinejad a platform from Iran or the head of Hezbollah or the head of Hamas. No, you don't give them a platform. I debate them. A lot of people don't agree with debating them. I've always debated. I debated Meir Kahane. I would have debated Yasser Arafat. I would have debated anybody. I believe in debate and dialogue, but I don't believe in giving people platforms to spew out hatred without challenging them and without confronting them. Again, let me renew my invitation to Beinart if he has the courage to come on at your show and debate me. You set the rules. You set the terms. Let's have a debate. Let's see if he can answer some hard questions instead of just preaching to people who don't know as much and withholding all the information necessary for those people to form wise judgments. He left out so much from that article. He's going to say, look, it's only an op-ed, but the selective editing of history in order to create a false narrative is what led me to call him willfully deceptive. I stand by those words.
We had Daniel Gordis on, and Daniel Gordis challenged American Jewish leadership to say, in essence, Peter, you've crossed the line, and now really we're done with you. And he then said, I wonder if American Jewish leadership has the strength to do that. What do you think American Jewish leadership's response to Beinart's going to be?
Oh, I think it's going to be criticism among some, sharp criticism, obviously, by some, more muted criticism by others. But generally, welcome to the debate. We're happy to have your point of view. We don't necessarily accept your point of view. But it's interesting because much of American Jewish leadership has tried to reject and marginalize Mort Klein, the head of the Zionist Organization of America, because he has views well to the right. And they're embarrassed by his views. And they probably won't try to marginalize Beinart because they're afraid of alienating Jewish kids on the left in colleges and universities. The most frightening thing about Beinart's views is that they will be appealing to young, ignorant Jewish students on American college campuses who know nothing about the history of Israel, but who want to be popular among their friends. I wrote my book, The Case for Israel, because a kid came to me and said, I never defend Israel on campus because I'm afraid if I do, I will become unpopular. Today, it takes no courage to be anti-Israel on campus. It takes an enormous amount of courage to be pro-Israel. And Beinart has now become the darling. He's given legitimacy to the anti-Israel hard left. He will go down in history as one of the most negative forces when Israel is struggling to achieve peace and to achieve a reasonable resolution of the Israeli-Arab, Israeli-Palestine resolution. He will end up in the wastebasket of history, condemned by history, condemned by Jewish and American historians who will see his efforts as self-serving, selfish, and encouraging hatred of Israel. He will encourage the hard left to become even more anti-Israel than it is today, because they'll be able to say, look, Peter Beinart thinks there shouldn't be Israel. Why should there be Israel? Let's end Israel. Let's end the nation state of the Jewish people. Let's impose the final solution on the nation state of the Jewish people, the end of Israel. That's Beinart.
Alan, that was fabulous. You are fabulous. I hope everybody reads your piece online, Newsweek, but I hope they've heard what you had to say. You say it eloquently, and you remain, I'll say this over and over, you remain Israel's strongest defender, and you're always welcome here on JBS. Thank you very, very much.
Well, thank you. Normally I'm less angry, but I have to tell you, I am really, really angry at Peter Beinart, who I've known for a long time. He really crossed the line into anti-Israel advocacy, and he will cause an enormous amount of harm among young people on college campuses today.
Thank you, Alan. My thanks, as always, to our director, Sloan Copeland, JBS's managing director, Dara Golub, transmission manager, John McDevitt, and to the producer of In the News, Carol Lilienthal. Until the next time, I'm Mark Golub. Stay safe and be well, my friends.